Welcome, everyone, to DEI After 5, the show that focuses on topics across diversity, equity, and inclusion with some of the brightest minds in the industry. Here's your hostess, inclusive culture curator, and coach, Sacha Thompson.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of DEI After 5. This is one that I have been looking forward to for a very long time. As many of you know, as you're in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and you're on social media, there are certain voices that you hear or you listen to that are just powerful, that speak to you, or that make you just call out. I know I do. I'm like, yes, okay, thank you for saying that. And so this is one of those people and one of those voices. And so my guest today is none other than Brittany Janay Harris. Hello, lady. How are you?
Look, came through with the gas. I feel honored. I feel honored, Sacha. I feel honored.
Thank you. Thank you. So for those that have been probably under a rock or something and just don't know you and your voice, tell us who you are.
I appreciate the love. I appreciate the space. I appreciate being in community with you today, Sacha, and certainly the folks who are part of the DEI After 5 community. I am Brittany Janay. And y'all, I've been in this like season of personal reckoning, like season of reflection. I've been doing my very best to answer the like, who are you, without necessarily leaning so heavy on like what I do, like who am I beyond, what I do. And so in this moment, I am in a season of transition. I am a learner and unlearner. I am full of questions, y'all. I'm full of questions of myself, of this world. I'm full of questions around this work. I am committed to being possibility. I am committed to being possibility for what it means to show up as one's most liberated self, which is a whole thing, is a whole journey. I am mother. I am Black woman. I am newly, talk about transition, y'all. I'm newly fiance, which is which I'm still processing. Like, right, cue Beyonce, right? I am something like a recovering DEI practitioner. And that probably feels loaded, but it is what it is. I am also creator of Liberated Love Notes, critical self-reflections and affirmations for the culture, which is an extension of my, personal praxis and hope for Black folks, not just to stay woke, but stay whole as we exist in systems not created with us in mind. Yeah, that's who I am right now.
I love it. I love it. And the reason why I think it's so important, I love that introduction of who you are, is because that takes a lot of reflection. And I have learned, especially living in the DC area for so long, everything is about what you do and who you do that for versus who you are. And so I appreciate just the reflection, the time that takes to really sit with that, because some of it is uncomfortable. Some of it, a lot of people don't want to admit that they're in transition or that they have questions. So I appreciate that, because that is also a part of this wellness work, this self-care work, this understanding who you are and whose you are.
Ooh, whose? We hear you. Okay.
In the process, right? So thank you for that. Talk to us a little bit more about Liberated Love Notes, because I honestly, I heard about Liberated Love Notes, I think right when you had kicked it off, and just having followed your voice for so long, and we've had some conversations, I was just like, okay, number one, yes, this is just makes so much sense. And two, like, so many people don't even know that they need liberation in this way. So talk to me a little bit about what led up to you doing Liberated Love Notes, how it is kind of transformed also since when you started.
Yeah. And so when I think about the origin story of Liberated Love Notes, it's actually very much so connected to how I introduce myself. And so I love that you named, it ain't just the DC culture. I love that you named how it is absolutely, or we're absolutely socialized to understand ourselves solely based on what we do. That's not by happenstance though. And so Liberated Love Notes is, and I use the language of my personal praxis because I was really beginning to interrogate as a DEI practitioner more thoughtfully, but more specifically as a Black DEI practitioner, how I have been internalizing anti-Blackness, colonialism, internalized forms of racism. And that shows up in really just seeing myself through the lens of, being a tool for production, not really sitting with and being still with and getting really curious about who I am, but then also like who I am from. And so I love when you said that. Liberated Love Notes at its simplest is a deck of affirmation cards. And so affirmations used to be like my primary love language, but the affirmations are specifically written to speak to what it means to build a healthy racial identity, what it means to disrupt the lie that is imposter syndrome, what it means to like think really critically. And so in as much as they're affirming y'all, they're also intended to get us as Black bodies thinking more critically about how I love when Audre Lorde, our ancestor, says the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house.
Yep.
How have we come to normalize ways of being that are not necessarily inherent to us, but absolutely, when you think about what it means to survive in corporate America, when you think about what it means to survive or at least strive to thrive in white spaces, we've internalized as the norm. And so Liberated Love Notes started out as love letters to people within my immediate sphere. My father, who works in a predominantly white space, my partner, who's a Black man in law enforcement. Matter of fact, I'm gonna try to find the one that I wrote for him. What does it mean to be part of systems that have caused harm to Black bodies and feel like you are accountable to that? Right?
Yeah.
Actively accountable to that. And so they are affirmations, they are reflection questions. They are part of what I feel like can get lost, especially as DEI practitioners, especially as Black DEI practitioners, that work can get lost because we are so sort of like externally focused in our work. We teach in them, we coach in them, we are supporting white folks in their journey. We are speaking truth to power about how institutions and organizations aren't doing the work, and maybe not always mindful of how we got our own work.
Yeah.
How if we're not careful in doing that work, we can cause just as much harm. So that's Liberated Love Notes, the deck, and then it ended up evolving into a podcast. It ended up evolving into a podcast where I'm just sharing every Monday just my own personal reflections and affirmations and things to think about, as we are in our respective workspaces. Yeah.
I love it. I love it. And it touches back on a conversation that I had on here with Cornell Verdeja Woodson around doing that internal work.
Hello.
Because so many people go into quote unquote DEI work Oh, I'm passionate about it. Oh, I want to help others. And I'm like, have you helped yourself? Because
Come, Sacha.
we have so many, and that's
Mhm.
not just white folks in this space, that's Black and brown folks in this
Mhm.
space as well too,
Mhm.
that have not done exactly what you're saying, unpacked. So how are we colonized in this space? How
Mhm.
are we showing up? How are we trying to dismantle some of the systems that are in place? And it's difficult to do that when your job is to uphold systems, right? So
Mm.
I appreciate and I love, and I think that's why I'm so connected to Liberated Love
Mhm.
Notes, because
Mhm.
it asks those tough questions. And as a coach, those are the questions that I
Oh,
ask, right? It's like we have to ask ourselves the tough questions and
yeah.
be able to sit in the discomfort of those answers or the process of getting to those answers.
But I appreciate what you said, Sacha, around like the questions piece. There's this like poem anecdote by Lucille Clifton. I consider Black woman, poet,
Mm,
consider her one of my like one of the Black women ancestors on my like spiritual board of directors. And she says, I don't create from a place of having the answers. I create from a place of like wonder and like questions, right?
mhm,
And I feel like it can be really, I love that one, because I think in any context where you are like consulting or coaching, the dominant cultural norm of like paternalism can like show up as I got all the answers, you know what I
mhm,
mean? Or let me tell you what you need to be doing, right?
mhm,
And I think there is something powerful about uh, taking this or embodying this work from like less of a posture of like sage on the stage, like I know it,
mhm.
I got it, and like God beside. I think that is easier to do when you understand how to embody it for yourself, right? When you
Yes.
understand or uncomfortable or and are comfortable with like having questions of yourself. I was trying to find one of these one of these one of these affirmations that like get at uh get at this like dynamic, or just to like give you an example of one.
Yeah. Well, while you're looking for that, I'm loving everything that you're saying because um and again, we're all in process, right? We're all in
Mhm.
transition in some way. And I've made this shift in my company, in my business, to do less facilitation and less workshops, because I've never been a fan of workshops, but I've done them,
Mm.
to culture change work and consulting and coaching,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? It's like I don't have the answers about your culture.
Mhm.
What I do have is a skill set of coaching that can help guide you to find the answers that you have within yourself,
Mhm.
right? And as part of an organization. And since I have done that shift, what I have found is organizations being more empowered to do the change than me just coming in to do a workshop,
Mhm.
right? That's not
I
changing
see that.
behaviors. That's
Mhm.
not dismantling systems. That's not holding people accountable. But if you
Mhm.
create a culture where
Mhm.
accountability, what does accountability look like here right now?
Mhm.
It starts to shift mindsets. And it took me doing exactly what you said, right? Being able to be, why is this not sitting well with me?
Mhm.
Why am I uncomfortable doing this? Right?
Mhm.
Because so many practitioners, we go in, we do workshops, we have some conversations, and then we're like, okay, on to the next one. And I'm like, that's not cutting it. That's not going to do this. And so that's why I appreciate this reflection of how do we shift ourselves in this space so that we can indeed begin liberating others as we've liberated ourselves. So, okay, yes, my mind.
I love it. I love it. And I even, one of the things that I heard as you were, one of the things that I appreciated and heard as you were speaking of just like the evolution of how you show up as a practitioner, is
Mm-hmm.
like being okay with the like iterative nature of that. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like
Yeah.
the iterative nature, like the journey work that even comes up, or that comes about, as we strive to understand how we want to show up in support of others. And I would say that that requires a certain degree of, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, I feel like that requires a certain degree of like stillness as well,
Oh
right? Like
yeah.
what does it mean? Like when I think about like this season that I find myself in, and I think about just sort of like where I am. And so one of the I guess life events that has put me or made me even more curious about how I will continue to just like iterate and show up in this space, was the transition of my grandfathers. Right.
Mm.
And so I'm gonna be honest, like up until, I haven't been as, even though there's been a lot going on, this is probably the most still and like
Mm.
attuned that I have been. Back in January, my maternal grandfather transitioned, and then shortly thereafter, my paternal grandfather both transitioned into a new realm as ancestors. Um, Part of this work, or like as I was, because I actually do, as you well know, I've do a lot of like education and learning experiences,
Mhm.
facilitation. And I would lift up as part of my introductions who I am, but also who I am from. I would share,
Mhm.
I am from Elmer Coppage Sr., I am from Louis A. Harris Sr. I have always felt connected to my elders, and certainly they've influenced this work. And so it was very difficult to manage their,
Yeah.
or mourn rather, mourn and grieve in this season. And it feels so divine. It feels so
Mm.
divine, Sacha, in that when we celebrated their lives, we referred to my maternal grandfather as a man of big faith. We referred to my paternal grandfather as a man of honor and provision. And so when I think about what it means to be still, when I think about transitions, when I think about how I've even been unlearning
Mhm.
dominant cultural understandings of like life and death, I've been thinking about how divine and beautiful it is to experience both big faith and
Mm.
provision as an inheritance in this season, right? As an inheritance in this season, everything about, and I know we've talked extensively, we've talked before about like decolonial approaches to like DEI. I've been thinking about like decolonial approaches to just like thinking and being,
Life.
you know what I mean?
Right.
It's like life, like right, like right when you think of even like in what we ascribe as being like wealth and inheritances, you know what I mean? Like we're
Mhm.
oftentimes limited to quantity over quality. That's
Mhm.
a pattern of white supremacy culture, right? And so I've been thinking about even in my practice, in an iterative form of being a practitioner, what does it mean to um, be responsive to the like spiritual self, right? What does it mean
Yeah.
to specifically as Black bodies, right? Specifically as Black bodies, there's a whole body of work around spirituality and the Black helping tradition.
Mm.
And I've been thinking about, and I've been thinking about, okay, DEI work, certainly organizational development work, personal development work. Uh, is it sufficient if we are only understanding people and humans sort of like, at the surface, if we're not also attentive to, our spiritual selves, right? I share all that because I feel like I'm all over the place at this point. When I hear you talk about like iterating, and how you've evolved and like how you want to serve clients, and the byproduct of that, I've been reflecting on, what does a work look like that supports change makers in like total sort of like being?
Yeah.
What does it look like specifically as we build solutions and as we build um, tools for Black change makers? How do we make sure that we're not just being responsive to like what they're doing in the workplace, but like who they are, like heart and soul? So So yeah.
You know what, Brittany, you just said you feel like you're all over the place, but you were not, because as you were talking, I was kind of thinking through not necessarily my journey, but what I've always gone back to is my purpose in this work.
Hello.
And so when I think about, two things came to mind when you were talking about your grandparents. One set of my grandparents passed before I was born. The other set I grew up knowing very well. But over the last few years, I've become the historian for our family. And so been working on the family tree kind of on both sides. And the side with the grandparents that I did not know well is the one that I've been doing a lot more of the deeper work there. And the stories that I am finding through not just people that knew them that are still with us, but even with documented in legal documents, right? Times and age. And I read a piece, and I knew this about my father's parents, in that you're talking the 1920s, 1930s, where both parents worked. And so they had help in the house. And you're talking about two Black people that had hired help in the home. She was a nurse, he was a police officer. And so how does that set up, a mindset of lived experience, and how has that trickled down? And so I've been processing and thinking that my father was a priest. And so how does that impact when I go back to Barbados? There's a whole cultural center named after him that I didn't even know about. Right. And so I'm just like, the impact of community. That was who everyone knew him as. Oh, he was all about community. And so it's when we talk about trauma, racial trauma being something that's part of our DNA, but also who we are is a part of our DNA as well too, and how that trickles through. Great grandmother was biracial. And I am blessed to have a cousin who was raised by her. And she says, race is not something about race isn't who you are. It's something you run and you win. And so with that mindset, how does that then influence how I approach this work? How I was named. Sacha means helper of mankind, right? How do I live in my name, right? So it's all of those things. So as you were talking, and even though you're feeling like you're like all over the place, that's what came back to me. It's just like, how do you know, what are the aspects of who you are that tell you what your purpose is in this work?
That's so freaking good, Sacha. So I think about the question, who are you? But then like how much power it is in asking folks, like, who are you from? Right? Like, who are you from? And like, how does that show up in certainly your purpose? Like, how do those like values, how does your spirituality, how do those inheritance, inheritances keep you, rooted and grounded? That is the level of like self and community inquiry that I feel like we deserve, but oftentimes don't experience, I guess, enough time for. I love what you said about this narrative, which is true. Like, right, we absolutely experience, generational and, race-based intergenerational trauma. And I don't know if that's primary, because I think about the intergenerational joys, and I think about the like intergenerational gifts. A lot of times folks will commend me for like my creativeness, like even when like Liberated Love Notes happened, and even in the context of my role at the Winters Group, I was creating. I was like, where does this come from? This comes from Lucille Coppage. Like Lucille Coppage is my maternal grandmother. And when I tell you this woman can make anything with her hands, I've seen her take toilet paper rolls and turn it into desk organizers. Like, I'm
Yeah.
like, Grams, like, how? Right? Let's talk about that as an inheritance, right? Let's
Yes.
talk about, right? I think about, and I know you'll oftentimes ask folks on your show around just like well-being and rest and
Mhm.
self-care. But I think about how even my grandparents made time for
Mm.
rest, right? There was a lot of I was in a conversation where there was a lot of debate on like, well, rest just doesn't feel as like practical. You know what I mean? It doesn't feel
Mm.
practical. And yet it is something that is like divinely ours.
Yeah.
It looks different. And so I think about my grandfather who never graduated from school, probably made it to, I think about the 6th grade before um, leaving the South and moving up here in Baltimore area. But rest for him looked like um, being in his, prayer closet, he called it,
Mm.
and reading his daily bread. Like,
Mm.
you know what I mean? Like that was rest for him. That was like
Yeah.
reprieve for him. And me knowing that, like when I find myself in situations where I'm like, oh, I just ain't got time. You know what I mean? Or I just can't find time. And I remember that, wow, my grandfather, who was a warehouse worker, worked multiple jobs, found time to just be. And you mean to tell me,
Yeah.
Britt, you mean to tell me
Can't find
that
five. Yes.
you mean to tell me you can't find time? You
Yeah.
don't believe you are worthy, right? Like, and so, yeah, that is the level of I love that you are even uh taking on the role as your like family's historian and archivist. I feel like that's me right now. Folks are like, how do you have so many videos of your grandparents? I feel blessed that I am still able to experience both of my grandmothers, and then even up until the top of this year had this community of both sets of grandparents, like just wrapped
Yeah.
in, right, just really wrapped in love. And so yeah, that is a part of work, a body of work, a body of like self-discovery. When we talk about what it means to center Blackness, like
Yeah.
even in the context of DEI, center Blackness, and this is where we can go back into the work of the Black helping tradition. Centering Blackness means being being mindful of the racialized self, the communal self, and the spiritual self, right? As tool, like as praxis, right? That's
Yeah.
the model, right? For how we can, from my perspective, certainly like shift the work, and how we go about the work.
Yeah. I mean, that's so key to all of this, right? And I always talk about being in community. And you started off this episode with, thank you for allowing me to be in community with you, because I feel like that is the essence of who we are, right? We are a communal people. And
Mm-hmm.
so that is how I approach DEI work, especially with other practitioners. It's not about competition. It's not about who can one up someone else. It's
Ooh.
how can we be in
Mhm.
community with each other and support each other in this space where I may lift you up at some time
Mhm.
or tell you sit your butt down also at some
Because
time.
loving accountability, right? Because
Yes,
loving accountability.
but we have to do that because we are all in this together. So I
Mhm.
want to continue and go back a step, because you did talk about that wellness and self-care piece. And so how do you take care of yourself in this work? I know you're in transition right now. I know um, reflection is a piece of self-care.
Mhm.
Um, and so, yeah, just talk to us a little bit about, some of the things that you're doing.
I'm really big on journaling. And
Mhm.
so some of my most significant just like personal like aha sort of like knowings that I've come into has happened by way of journaling. And
Mhm.
so I really appreciate journaling. I have been more intentional around like ancestral reverence
Mhm.
as part of my care like practice. And so that looks like, so I have my downstairs in my dining room. I have pictures of my grandfathers. I have my candles, and sometimes I will. They actually loved coming here to like share cups of coffee, and so I'll spend some mornings. Stillness looks like pouring me a cup of coffee and laying out coffee for them, and just like sitting there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I have experienced so much peace by way of, and folks may refer to it as ancestral veneration, ancestral reverence. That has become a big part of my just sort of like care strategy, something that's like soul nourishing, right? Just like soul nourishing. I actually set up a little mini oasis in my backyard, y'all. And so as a like remote worker, it can be really, and as much as I love my little office setup, super affirming, right? The outdoors
Yeah.
feels like warm and nourishing to me. And so I got my little oasis in my backyard. And we'll literally just sit out there. Just sit out there.
Love it.
I actually just took up, so I started to realize that music has always been healing for me. I got a whole like liberated like love songs to self playlist. Music has always been something where depending on how I'm feeling, I can play a song and I literally feel like something different, like in my body and how I think. Like Sounds of Blackness.
Oh,
What?
yeah.
Like, what? So I started to get really curious about why like music. And so I've been taking on like sound healing, right? Learning a little bit more about sound and energy healing. And it is very much so physiological, right? What music can do like for our bodies and settle in our bodies. And so music is one for me. And then certainly last year, I started to get a little bit more curious about just like somatics. And so like the somatic abolitionist space, somatic abolitionism space, and started to develop just like body practices that allow me to settle myself in real time, especially in, just the role as a practitioner slash
Practitioner,
like change
yes.
maker, right? And so like something as simple as a hum, like Sacha, like when I am overwhelmed, like a hum. That's a way that I like care for like sometimes self-care can feel like those things that you do, like, I'm gonna carve out some time, 30 minutes
Oh,
here, maybe an hour here, wait till the weekend. Sometimes care for me is getting off of a Zoom call that had me a bit overwhelmed and like really hand over heart,
yeah.
whether it's rocking, whether it's humming, getting really curious about
Tapping
what like
is
my
another
body
one.
is telling me.
Yeah.
Yes, like, right. So yeah.
Wow. And that, I
Yeah.
mean, we did an episode with Dr. Rufus Spann, and he talks about aftercare. And so that is what that is, right? It's in the
Mhm.
moment, what you need to
Yeah.
do right after
Yes.
something has happened, and the importance of that and not putting it off. So, Brittany, thank you, thank you, thank you. How can people get in contact with you if they would love to hear more about Liberated Love Notes, or
Yeah.
just be, like I said, your voice is just powerful to me, and I love listening and talking to you all the time. So, how can they connect with you?
Absolutely. So definitely stay connected via the site. And so that's BrittanyJanay.com. Mention the podcast. And so I'm in the second season. And so Liberated Love Notes is on Apple Podcasts and everywhere else. Definitely subscribe and all the things. I'm on Instagram, Liberated Love Notes, and then also Brittany Janay _. And then certainly I'm in those LinkedIn streets too. Just my
Yeah.
name. I'm in these
In
LinkedIn
those
streets. So yeah, right.
I
So
love it. I
stay
love it.
connected in
So,
that way. Yeah.
Brittany, thank you so much for spending this time with us today. This I always think about, when I step away from these, like this made my heart sing, because there was just so
Mm.
many things that just affirmed what's going on in my head. So thank you for that. And everyone, thank you for joining us today. I hope you found a few nuggets or a few moments of inspiration, a few ahas in this conversation today. And as always, you can find us here on YouTube or your favorite podcast station. Subscribe, like, follow, give us comments. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, have a good one.